Hanging judge ordered a duel, not knowing his own son would face the gunslinger. Judge Blackwood had sentenced 43 men to hang, but when he signed that duel order at sunrise, he was unknowingly signing his own son's death warrant. A father who chose law over love was about to lose everything that ever mattered. The morning sun bled through the courthouse windows like judgment itself, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor where so many men had heard their final verdicts. Judge Cornelius Blackwood sat behind his elevated bench, a mountain of black robes and weathered certainty, his gavel resting in his hand like the hammer of God. Below him, Black Creek, Morrison stood in iron shackles, his hat removed but his defiance intact, eyes the color of storm clouds meeting the judge's unwavering stare. "You stand accused of murder in the first degree." Blackwood's voice rolled through the packed courtroom like distant thunder. "The shooting of Thomas Henley in cold blood outside the Silver Dollar Saloon." "How do you answer?" Morrison's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I answer that Thomas Henley drew first, Your Honor. But I also answer that your court ain't fit to judge a man like me." A murmur rippled through the gallery like wind through wheat. Blackwood's knuckles whitened around his gavel, but his voice remained steady as stone. "This court is the only law between here and hell, Morrison. You'll find no mercy in either place." "Mercy?" Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I ain't asking for mercy, Judge. I'm asking for justice. Real justice, not the kind you dish out from that throne of yours." Blackwood leaned forward, his gray eyes narrowing. "Speak plainly, or hold your tongue. Trial by combat." The words fell into the courtroom like stones into still water. "It's still law in this territory, ain't it, Judge? Old law, but law all the same. Written right there in them dusty books you're so fond of." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. In the gallery, men shifted in their seats like horses before a storm. Women clutched their shawls tighter. Even the flies seemed to stop buzzing around the oil lamps that hung from the ceiling like hanged men. Blackwood's face remained a mask of granite, but inside his mind raced through the legal codes he knew by heart. The law Morrison spoke of was ancient, a relic from territorial days when civilization was thin as paper and justice came at the end of a gun. It had been invoked perhaps 3 times in 20 years, and never in his court. "Trial by combat requires a champion," Blackwood said finally. "Who would stand for a man like you?" "Someone will." Morrison's confidence was unshakable as bedrock. "There's always someone willing to face death for the right cause. Question is, Judge, you got the backbone to honor the law when it don't suit your particular brand of justice." The gallery erupted in whispers and shuffling feet. Blackwood raised his gavel, and the sharp crack silenced them all. He stared down at Morrison, this man who had killed 6 people and shown no remorse, who now stood in chains demanding the right to potentially walk free through violence. But the law was the law. It had been Blackwood's creed for 23 years on the bench, through cattle wars and claim disputes, through the hanging of rustlers and the sentencing of claim jumpers. He had built his reputation on the bedrock principle that the law was absolute, immutable, sacred. To bend it now would be to break everything he had stood for. "The court recognizes your right under Territorial Statute 47B, he said, his voice carrying the weight of inevitability. "Trial by combat is hereby granted. You have until sunrise tomorrow to find your champion." Morrison nodded once, sharp and satisfied. "Sunrise it is, Your Honor." As the bailiff led Morrison away, his chains clanking like church bells in the sudden silence, Blackwood remained seated, his gavel still in his hand. The courtroom emptied slowly, voices buzzing with excitement and speculation. Who would be fool enough to stand against Black Creek Morrison? The man was faster than summer lightning and twice as deadly. Alone now, except for the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, Blackwood finally set down his gavel and removed his spectacles. He rubbed his eyes, feeling every one of his 58 years settling into his bones like winter cold. Outside, he could hear the town coming alive with news of tomorrow's duel. Bets would be placed, sides chosen, prayers whispered. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small silver locket, its surface worn smooth by countless worried fingers. Inside was a photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a boy with his father's stubborn chin. Sarah had been dead 8 years now, consumption taking her as surely as his own pride had driven away their son. Samuel would be 25 now, if he was still alive. 5 years since he'd ridden away, calling his father a heartless man who cared more for law than love. 5 years of silence, of wondering if his boy was dead in some distant grave or alive, and simply choosing never to return. Blackwood closed the locket and slipped it back into his pocket. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. The law demanded its due, and he had never been a man to shirk his duty, no matter the cost. But as the sun settled toward the western mountains, painting the sky the color of old blood, Judge Cornelius Blackwood couldn't shake the feeling that he had just set something in motion that would change everything, something that would test not just the law he served, but the very foundations of the man he had become. The weight of his decision settled over the courthouse like evening shadows, and somewhere in the distance, a rider approached the town limits, drawn by stories of an iron judge who had forgotten that justice without mercy could destroy more than it saved. The young gunfighter volunteering to face Black Creek Morrison had his father's eyes, but the hanging judge didn't recognize his own son. The stranger rode into town as the sun painted the wooden storefronts gold and crimson, his horse's hooves stirring up dust that caught the dying light like scattered prayers. He was tall in the saddle, lean as a whip handle, with dark hair that curled beneath a weather-beaten hat and eyes the color of winter storm clouds. Those who watched him pass noticed the way he sat his horse, confident but not cocky, alert but not afraid. The kind of man who had seen trouble and lived to tell about it. Samuel Blackwood, though he hadn't used that name in 5 long years, guided his mare toward the livery stable, his heart heavy with memories he'd tried to bury in 1,000 miles of wandering. The town looked smaller than he remembered, more weathered, like an old man who had forgotten how to smile. But the courthouse still dominated the main street like a monument to judgment, its bell tower reaching toward heaven as if begging forgiveness for all the harsh verdicts it had witnessed. He had not planned to return. For 5 years, he had drifted from cattle drives to mining camps, from railroad construction to frontier trading posts, always moving, always running from the ghost of his father's disappointment. But word had a way of traveling in the territories, carried by cowboys and peddlers, by gamblers and circuit preachers. Word of the hanging judge who showed no mercy, who sent men to their deaths with the cold precision of a butcher cutting meat. "That your father?" men would ask when they learned his name. "That iron bastard in Cedar Falls who's hanged more men than cholera?" Samuel would lie and say no, but inside, something twisted like a knife between his ribs. This was what his father had become, a legend of cruelty, a man who had forgotten that justice was supposed to heal, not just punish. At the livery stable, an old man with tobacco-stained whiskers took Samuel's horse and looked him over with curious eyes. "You picked an interesting time to visit Cedar Falls, son. Town's buzzing like a kicked hornet's nest." "How's that?" Samuel asked, though something in his chest already knew. "Trial by combat," the old man said, spitting into the straw. "Black Creek Morrison called for it, and Judge Blackwood granted it. Sunrise tomorrow, someone's going to face the fastest gun in 3 territories. Most folks figure it'll be a short fight and a quick funeral." Samuel felt the blood drain from his face. His father, his stubborn, prideful father, had actually allowed such a thing. Morrison have a champion yet? Nope. Been asking around all evening, but ain't nobody fool enough to face him. Hell, I see Morrison draw once down in Tucson. Faster than a striking snake and twice as deadly. Samuel paid for his horse's care and walked slowly back onto the main street, his mind racing. The town was alive with excitement. Men gathered in clusters outside the saloon and general store, their voices carrying fragments of conversation on the evening breeze. Bets being placed. Odds calculated. Death being treated like entertainment. It was then he saw him. Judge Cornelius Blackwood stood on the courthouse steps, still in his black robes, speaking quietly with the sheriff. Even at a distance, Samuel could see that his father had aged. His hair was whiter now, his shoulders perhaps a little more stooped, but his bearing remained as rigid as a cavalry officer's. The man who had raised him with iron discipline and unwavering principles, who had never shown weakness or doubt, who had sent his own son away rather than bend. Samuel's hand moved unconsciously to his gun, not in threat but in measurement. 5 years of hard living had taught him things his father's law books never could. He had learned to shoot not for sport but for survival, had faced down claim jumpers and cattle thieves, had earned the respect of men who measured worth in courage rather than education. "You looking for someone to face Morrison?" Samuel turned to find the sheriff approaching, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a careful way of moving. The badge on his vest caught the lamplight from the saloon windows. "Maybe," Samuel said. "Depends on what he's accused of. Murder. Shot Tom Henley outside the Silver Dollar 3 days ago. Tom was a good man, had a wife and 2 little girls. Morrison killed him over a poker game gone wrong." Samuel nodded slowly. He had known men like Morrison, had seen what they left in their wake: widows and orphans, broken families, and shattered lives. The kind of men his father's harsh justice was meant to stop, even if the judge had forgotten that justice was supposed to protect the innocent, not just punish the guilty. "I'll do it," Samuel heard himself say. The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "Son, you sure about that? Morrison ain't just fast. He's mean. Killed 6 men in fair fights, and probably twice that many in unfair ones." "I'm sure. What's your name?" Samuel hesitated for just a moment, then said, "Sam Blake." It was close enough to the truth, and far enough from it to keep his father from knowing, at least until tomorrow morning when it would be too late to matter. Word spread through the town like wildfire in dry grass. The stranger had accepted Morrison's challenge. Bets were adjusted. Prayers were whispered. And in the courthouse, Judge Cornelius Blackwood sat alone in his chambers, staring at a photograph of his dead wife and lost son, wondering if he had finally pushed his precious law too far. Outside his window, the town settled into an uneasy sleep, but Samuel Blake walked the empty streets until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. He thought about his mother, dead these 8 years. He thought about the father who had loved the law more than his own family. And he thought about the morning to come, when all debts would be paid and all truths revealed. The wind whispered through the wooden buildings, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. In a few hours, the sun would rise on Cedar Falls, and with it would come a reckoning that neither father nor son could have imagined. As Samuel walked toward his destiny, the silver locket in his father's pocket seemed to grow heavier, as if the weight of love and regret were finally too much for one man to carry alone. The judge's gavel fell from his trembling fingers when he saw his champion's face, 20 years of iron resolve shattered in a single heartbeat. Dawn broke over Cedar Falls like a wound splitting open, painting the sky in shades of blood and brass, while the town gathered in the wide dirt lot behind the courthouse. They came in silence, men removing their hats, women clutching their children close, everyone understanding they were about to witness something that would be whispered about for generations. The morning air was still and heavy, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Judge Cornelius Blackwood stood on a wooden platform erected for the occasion, his black robes hanging loose around his diminished frame. In his hands, he held the leather-bound book of territorial law, its pages yellow with age and heavy with precedent. This was what he had built his life upon, the absolute authority of written law, the sacred bond between justice and order. But as he watched the crowd gather below, something cold and uncertain moved through his chest like winter wind through bare branches. Beside him, the sheriff checked his pocket watch. 5 minutes, Your Honor. Blackwood nodded, his throat too tight for words. Across the lot, Black Creek Morrison stood with his back against the courthouse wall, his hands loose at his sides, eyes scanning the crowd with the lazy confidence of a predator. He was a man built for violence, broad shoulders, narrow hips, fingers that moved with the fluid grace of someone who had killed so often it had become as natural as breathing. "Where's this champion of yours?" Morrison called out, his voice carrying easily across the silent crowd. "Sun's coming up, and I got places to be." A murmur rippled through the gathered townspeople. Some craned their necks, looking for the stranger who had volunteered to face certain death. Others shook their heads, convinced the mysterious gunfighter had come to his senses and fled in the night. Even the sheriff looked worried, glancing repeatedly toward the main street. Then he appeared. Sam Blake walked through the crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea, men and women stepping aside to let him pass. He wore a clean white shirt and dark trousers, his gun belt sitting low on his hips, the holster tied down in the manner of someone who expected to use it. His hat was pulled low, casting shadows across his face, but there was something in his bearing, the way he moved, the set of his shoulders, that made several people in the crowd exchange knowing glances. "That boy looks familiar," someone whispered. "Got the walk of a Blackwood," another voice murmured. But Judge Blackwood, elevated on his platform and focused on the legal proceedings, saw only another young man about to die for the sake of territorial law. He opened the ancient book in his hands, his voice carrying across the lot like a funeral bell. "By the authority vested in this court by the territory of Arizona, and according to Statute 47B regarding trial by combat, let this matter be decided by force of arms. The accused, Thomas Morrison, stands represented by his own hand. The people of this territory stand represented by—" Blackwood paused, looking down at his notes. "Sam Lake." The young man stepped into the center of the lot, and for the first time raised his head to look directly at the judge. The leather book fell from Cornelius Blackwood's hands, its pages fluttering like dying birds as it hit the wooden platform. 23 years of absolute certainty, of unwavering faith in law and order, of iron resolve forged in the crucible of frontier justice. All of it crumbled to dust in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Those eyes, storm gray and defiant, exactly like his mother's, but with the stubborn set of his father's jaw. The boy he had raised with firm discipline and harder lessons. The son who had called him heartless and ridden away 5 years ago into a silence deeper than any grave. Samuel, the name escaped Blackwood's lips like a prayer, so quiet that only the sheriff beside him heard it. But Samuel heard it too. Across 30 yards of dusty ground and 20 years of accumulated hurt, their eyes met and held. Time seemed to stop, the crowd fading into nothing, Morrison's presence forgotten. Father and son, separated by pride and united by blood, seeing each other clearly for the first time in decades. Samuel's hand trembled slightly above his gun. This was not how it was supposed to happen. He had come to face Morrison, to prove something to himself about justice and courage, to strike a blow against the kind of senseless violence that destroyed families. He had not come to break his father's heart in front of half the territory. "You know this boy, Judge?" Morrison's voice cut through the moment like a knife. "Personal acquaintance of yours?" Blackwood tried to speak, but found no words. His son, his lost, beloved, stubborn son, stood in the dust below, about to face death for the sake of laws the judge himself had enforced. The terrible irony of it crashed over him like a collapsing mountain. His pursuit of absolute justice, his refusal to bend or show mercy, had led to this moment where his own flesh and blood might die to satisfy the legal codes he worshipped. "Answer the question, Your Honor," Morrison pressed, his hand moving closer to his gun. "Or maybe we should just get on with this. I got a reputation to maintain." Samuel found his voice first. "He doesn't know me," he said clearly, his eyes never leaving his father's face. "I'm just a man who believes some things are worth fighting for." The lie cut Blackwood deeper than any blade. But in Samuel's eyes, he saw something that made his chest tighten with a mixture of pride and terror. His boy had grown into a man, scarred by hard years and harder choices, but still carrying the spark of righteousness that had always burned in the Blackwood blood. The sheriff stepped forward. "Gentlemen, take your positions. 10 paces back to back, then turn and draw my signal." Samuel and Morrison walked toward each other, their boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. As they passed, Morrison leaned close enough to whisper, "Nothing personal, boy. But I've been killing men since before you could hold a gun." Samuel didn't respond, but something in his eyes made Morrison's confident smile falter slightly. They turned back to back, and the sheriff began counting off the paces. With each step, Blackwood felt his heart breaking a little more. 1, 2, 3. The son he had lost through his own rigid pride was about to die for the sake of the very justice he had chosen over family. 4, 5, 6. Stop. The word tore from Blackwood's throat like a physical thing, raw and desperate. The entire crowd turned to stare at him. Morrison paused mid-stride. Samuel's shoulders tensed, but he didn't look back. For a moment that stretched like eternity, Judge Cornelius Blackwood stood frozen between the law he had served faithfully for over 2 decades and the love he had buried beneath duty and pride. In his mind, he could hear his wife's voice from long ago. "A heart without mercy is just a stone, Cornelius. And stones make poor fathers." The morning sun climbed higher, and in its harsh light, a man who had built his life on absolute certainties found himself face to face with the one truth he had never been able to judge, that love, not law, was the only justice that truly mattered. The hanging judge who had never shown mercy finally learned that some laws are written in the heart, not in dusty books. The word "stop" echoed across the silent lot like a gunshot, freezing every soul within earshot. Judge Cornelius Blackwood stood on his platform, his black robes billowing in the morning breeze, his face pale as winter moonlight. Below him, Samuel remained motionless, his back still turned, while Morrison pivoted with predatory grace, his hand hovering inches from his gun. "Judge." The sheriff's voice was uncertain, colored by 20 years of watching Blackwood never waver, never doubt, never bend. "What are your orders?" Blackwood stepped down from the platform, his legs unsteady as those of a man who had aged a decade in the span of a heartbeat. The leather-bound law book lay forgotten where it had fallen, its pages fluttering in the dust like prayers torn from their moorings. He walked toward his son with the slow, careful steps of someone approaching a wild animal, afraid that any sudden movement might send the boy running again. "Samuel." His voice cracked on the name like ice breaking under spring's sun. Finally, Samuel turned. The years had carved lines around his eyes, had weathered his skin and hardened his jaw, but the boy Blackwood had raised was still there, visible in the way he held his shoulders and the stubborn set of his mouth. "Hello, father." The words were soft, almost lost in the morning air. Morrison looked between them, his killer's instincts reading the currents of emotion flowing through the crowd. "Well, ain't this touching? Family reunion right here in the dust." His voice carried the mocking edge of a man who had never known what it meant to love something more than his own reputation. "Don't matter none to me who he is. The law's the law, right, Judge? That's what you've been preaching all these years." The law. Blackwood repeated the words as if tasting something bitter. He had lived by those 2 words, had used them to justify every harsh sentence, every man sent to the gallows, every moment of mercy denied. The law had been his religion, his compass, his excuse for choosing justice over compassion. And now it stood between him and the son he had lost through his own rigid pride. "You got 2 choices, Judge," Morrison continued, emboldened by the older man's obvious distress. "You can stop this duel and admit your precious law don't mean nothing when it touches your own blood. Show this whole territory that the hanging judge is just another hypocrite who bends the rules for family." His smile was sharp as a blade. "Or you can let it continue and watch your boy die for the sake of your reputation." The crowd pressed closer, sensing they were witnessing something historic. Men who had feared Blackwood's absolute justice now watched to see if the Iron Judge would crack. Women whispered prayers under their breath. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, understanding only that something momentous was happening in the dust and morning light. Samuel spoke quietly, his words meant only for his father's ears. You don't have to choose me over the law, Pa. I knew what I was walking into. Did you? Blackwood's voice was raw with 20 years of suppressed emotion. Did you know you were walking into your father's courtroom? Did you know you were volunteering to die for a man who represents everything I've stood against? I knew. Samuel's admission fell between them like a stone into still water. I came back to see what you'd become. What they said about you in the territories, the hanging judge who never showed mercy, who cared more for law than for people. I had to see if there was anything left of the man who used to read me stories about knights and honor. Blackwood felt tears threatening for the first time in decades. And what did you find? A man who forgot that justice without mercy is just revenge wearing a badge. The words hit harder than any physical blow. Blackwood looked around at the crowd, at the faces watching his private moment of reckoning. These people had respected him, feared him, trusted him to stand between them and chaos. He had built his life on being immovable, unshakable, absolute in his adherence to written law. But laws were made by men, and men were fallible. However, love was written by God himself in the human heart. Morrison, Blackwood said, his voice gaining strength. You want a trial by combat. You got it. But the law also gives me authority over how that combat is conducted. Morrison's eyes narrowed. What are you getting at, old man? Blackwood walked to where his son stood and placed a weathered hand on Samuel's shoulder. The combat will be fought, but not to the death. First blood ends it. And if you win, Morrison, you're free to go. But if you lose, if even a drop of your blood is spilled, you hang at sunset. That ain't how trial by combat works. Morrison snarled. That's how it works in my court. Blackwood's voice carried all the authority he had accumulated over 23 years on the bench. The law gives me discretion in matters of procedure. Accept it, or forfeit and face the gallows now. Morrison's face twisted with rage, but he was trapped by his own demand for legal justice. Fine. First blood it is. Samuel looked at his father with something approaching wonder. It wasn't mercy. Blackwood was still requiring the duel to proceed, still upholding the law Morrison had demanded. But it was compassion, a recognition that justice could be served without requiring death. 10 paces, the sheriff called out, his voice steadier now that he understood what his judge was doing. The two men walked their paces again, but this time the tension was different. This wasn't about death anymore. It was about honor, about proving that courage could exist without cruelty, that justice could be served without destroying everything good in its path. On the signal, both men spun and drew. Morrison was fast, faster than summer lightning, just as his reputation claimed. But Samuel had learned his speed in places where hesitation meant death, where the law was whatever a man could enforce with his own hand. His gun cleared leather a heartbeat after Morrison's, but his aim was truer. Morrison's shot went wide, kicking up dust 2 feet from Samuel's boots. Samuel's bullet found its mark, not Morrison's heart or head, but his gun hand, spinning the weapon from his grasp and sending a spray of blood across the morning air. Morrison fell to his knees, clutching his wounded hand, his face twisted with pain and disbelief. You cheated somehow, he gasped. No, Samuel said quietly, holstering his gun. I just fought for something worth fighting for. As the doctor tended to Morrison's wound, Blackwood approached his son. They stood together in the settling dust, father and son, 20 years of separation and stubborn pride hanging between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. You could have killed him, Blackwood observed. So could you have, these past 20 years. You could have shown mercy to men who deserved it, chosen compassion over rigid law. But you didn't because you were afraid it would make you weak. Blackwood removed his black robes slowly, letting them fall to the ground like a shed skin. Underneath, he was just a man, tired, flawed, human. I was wrong. About a lot of things. Samuel nodded toward Morrison, now being helped toward the doctor's office. What happens to him? He'll face trial. A real trial this time, with a jury and proper defense. And if he's found guilty, he'll serve time in territorial prison. Justice doesn't require death, son. I forgot that somewhere along the way. As the crowd began to disperse, talking excitedly about what they had witnessed. Father and son walked together toward the courthouse steps. The sun was fully up now, painting the world in honest light instead of the bloody colors of dawn. "Will you stay?" Blackwood asked, not daring to hope. Samuel looked up at the courthouse bell tower, then back at his father. "For a while. Someone needs to teach the new judge how to balance law with love." "New judge? You're retiring, aren't you?" A man who just learned the most important lesson of his life doesn't usually go back to making the same mistakes. Cornelius Blackwood smiled, really smiled, for the first time in 20 years. "I suppose I am. Cedar Falls could use a sheriff, though. Someone who understands that justice is about protecting people, not just punishing them." They walked up the courthouse steps together, and with each step, the weight of old hurts and stubborn pride grew lighter. Behind them, the morning wind scattered the dust from the lot where mercy had finally triumphed over law, where a father had chosen love over reputation, and where two men had learned that the strongest justice is the kind that heals rather than destroys. In his pocket, the silver locket with his wife's photograph seemed to warm against Blackwood's chest. Sarah would have been proud, he thought. She had always known that a heart without mercy was just a stone, and that stones made poor fathers. But men, fallible, loving, human men, could always learn to do better. The sun climbed higher over Cedar Falls, and in its light, a town that had known only harsh justice began to glimpse what mercy looked like when it walked hand in hand with courage.